Okay, we'll start with this. Unified super middleweight champion Franchon Crews raised some very valid questions in reference to BoxRec's divisional rank standings. She asked, "I'm just so confused. Why the disrespect when it comes to me?" And what Franchon Crews is referencing are BoxRec's current divisional rank standings. BoxRec's divisional rank standings over the years have been a tried and true, trusty method of keeping up with a division's best fighters.
The pound-for-pound list was always shit.
BoxRec's pound-for-pound list was always a piece of garbage, but their strength really was their divisional rank standings, the best fighters at a given weight. But the last 12 months or so, perhaps even a little over a year,
something changed.
Something went wrong. Something is awry with BoxRec's algorithm, as BoxRec's divisional rank standings aren't based on a panel of votes the way that ESPN's or Ring Magazine's or Transnational Boxing Rankings divisional ranks are based on a panel of votes. No, with BoxRec, it's all based on an algorithm. And a little over a year ago, something happened, something changed, and those divisional rank standings haven't been the same since. You'll notice that Christina Hammer, who is not a world titleist at this weight, she's ranked ahead of everyone else, Franchon Crews included.
And it can't be reconciled.
It can't be explained. Since losing to Clarissa Shields, Christina Hammer has had two fights, one at middleweight and one at super middleweight against pedestrian-level opponents, and that's putting it nicely. How does fighting those girls get you ranked ahead of both world champions at this weight? How does that make sense?
She's number one.
Alejandra Jimenez ranks in at number 2. Alejandra Jimenez, who hasn't fought in well over a year, since January of 2020 when she faced Franchon Crews.
Tested positive for a banned substance.
That decision win was turned into a no decision. Alejandra Jimenez is ranked ahead of the 2 world champions at this weight, in spite of not having fought for over a year, in spite of having the decision in her last fight overturned to a no decision due to unsportsmanlike conduct.
She's a juicer.
Aline Cedar-Ruz, one of the only 2 champions at this weight, unified champion Aline Cedar-Ruz, she ranks in at number 3, behind Christina and behind Alejandra. Behind Aline is Alicia Napoleon, who ranks in at number 4. Hasn't seen any action in a long time. She's been away with child. She also ranks ahead of Franchon Crews, as does Letitia Robinson. You tell me, what has Letitia Robinson done at 168 pounds that Franchon Crews hasn't? Franchon's a current unified champion who has seen action in the last 12 months.
Whereas Letitia hasn't.
Don't get me wrong. Letitia Robinson is actually one to look out for at this weight. She sports a professional record of 16 wins with only 1 loss, 6 knockouts. Solid record.
Or about as solid as it can be at these weights.
Relatively speaking, but Letitia Robinson is not an active reigning world champion the way that Franchon Crews is, and Letitia Robinson hasn't seen any action since February of last year. It's been well over a year since she had a fight. Then we come to the number 6 ranked Claire Hafner, Canada's own Claire Hafner, who, get this, is coming off of 2 back-to-back losses. That's right, 2 back-to-back losses, and she's ranked ahead of Franchon Crews. Her last fight, she squared off against Letitia Robinson. She lost that fight. And before that, she lost a fight to New Zealand's own Giovanna Perez. This is a fighter who's coming off of 2 consecutive losses, yet for some reason, she's ranked ahead of Franchon. Franchon Crews, who has seen action in the last 12 months, saw action at the beginning of this year in January. Unlike Letitia, unlike Claire Hafner, Franchon, who's a current reigning unified champion at this weight,
who set the unified with Aline Cedar-Ruz
for what will be the undisputed super middleweight championship at this weight. And you're telling me that Franchon ranks in at number 7 behind all these other girls?
What the fuck's going on here?
And the buck don't stop there as far as BoxRec's haphazard divisional rank standings. You'll notice that in the men's junior welterweight division, they've got Gervonta Davis ranked in at number 1, ahead of everyone else. Bear in mind, he's only had 1 fight there, and it wasn't even against a top guy, a top shelf, top tier, top level opponent. It was against Mario Barrios. You're telling me that beating Mario Barrios gets you ranked ahead of this division's undisputed champion? BoxRec's divisional rank standings were never perfect, but they were solid, they were consistent, and there was a time when they made a lot of sense. A hell of a lot more sense than they've been making the last 12 months. I mean, you got Josh Taylor ranked behind a guy who's only had 1 fight at this weight. You have both Aline Cedar-Ruz and Franchon Crews, that division's only champions, ranked behind Christina Hammer, who fought a pedestrian-level opponent in her last fight and isn't even campaigning in the sport of professional boxing. She has since left for the amateur ranks. Really don't know how that's working out. I don't think she went to Tokyo. Don't think she's going. Better still, this is what's going on via BoxRec's rank standings, and it's been this way for about a year. The story is
They manually changed something.
the algorithm hasn't been the same since. Something was manually changed, BoxRec's rank standings, in order to accommodate the winner of Wilder versus Fury 2. At least that's the story the junkies are singing on these boxing streets. And I feel so inclined to believe this because it was right around that time that you started noticing a lot of discrepancies in BoxRec's divisional rank standings. I reiterate, their pound-for-pound list was always shit, but their divisional ranks, they were actually pretty solid for a long time. And somewhere along the line, something changed. And I think that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. In the end, this fundamental flaw in BoxRec's algorithm affects BoxRec's credibility the most. I mean, there'll always be a good scorekeeper for a fighter's record. If you want to know who did what and when, you can always reference them. But as far as divisional ranks,
All going to hell in a handbasket.
their divisional ranks are shot down, and they will no longer be an adequate barometer for the state of a weight class, for the state of a division, until this fundamental flaw in their algorithm is corrected, because the champions themselves are starting to notice. In other news, Tony Yoka, Olympic gold medalist Tony Yoka, announced that he's going to be back in action in September against Croatia's own Milas, who sports a professional record of 15 wins, no losses, with 11 knockouts. This is yet another fight for Tony that's taking place in his neck of the woods.
Over there in France.
And as early as January of last year, before the pandemic started, we saw a lot of rumors, a lot of rumblings, a lot of reports about how Tony Yoka was supposed to be crossing over there to the top-ranked side of things. Since then, he hasn't actually fought under the banner.
And it's not because he hasn't been fighting.
He has been fighting. He's fought 3 times since the pandemic started. He's one of the few fighters whose career wasn't stifled by the COVID-19 pandemic. He fought Johan Duhaupas, he fought Christian Hammer, he fought Joel Tomboy Jaco. He squeezed in 3 fights since the pandemic started. This will be the 4th. But he has yet to debut under the top-ranked banner over here, United States, and one is left to wonder if whatever talks, whatever conversations were being had...
And is he signed to Top Rank?
Did he ever actually enter into a multi-fight or multi-year deal with the people over there at Top Rank? Because it really doesn't look like it. This is yet another fight that's set to go down in his neck of the woods. And given how unappreciative boxing fans can be over here in the United States, and how some have taken a liking to
Diminishing foreign fighters.
xenophobia amongst boxing fans in the United States really is at an all-time high. And if you're Tony Yoka, what you have to ask yourself is, are you really better suited fighting in the United States, or should you just stay in your neck of the woods where you at least have a following of some kind?
And just develop over there.
I think there are benefits to both scenarios. I think there are pros and cons associated with both situations. Fighting primarily out of France, or coming over to the United States, fighting over here.
Don't forget what the crux of the conversation is.
Crux of it all is that all that talk of Tony Yoka crossing over to the top-ranked side of things and fighting over here in the United States, it seems to have slowed as of late, because that hasn't happened yet. His very next fight is going to be over there in France, and one is left to wonder what the state of that relationship is, if there even is a relationship.
The pandemic has eased up.
I mean, we're not now in 2021 where we were this same time last year. Things have gotten better. Crowds are returning to live sporting events. Live gates are returning to boxing. And yet Tony Yoka hasn't fought under Top Rank. Not yet. And one is left to wonder if he's ever going to, or has he doubled back on that decision? If Tony's going to primarily fight out of France, he'd be better suited pairing up with Matchroom than Top Rank, a U.S.-based promoter, a U.S.-based outfit.
But that'd be better off at Matchroom.
Or even Wasserman Promotions. Cal, Nisei, Sarlin, the Sarlin brothers. I mean, if you're going to fight primarily in Europe,
You might as well get yourself a European promoter.
it stands to reason, and I'm not saying he shouldn't sign with Top Rank. I'm just saying that all that news doesn't seem to have materialized. It hasn't seemed to have gone anywhere. He's still fighting out of France, and if he's going to stay in France, might as well get himself a European promoter instead of an American one. In other news, Rick Glaser tweeted, "The fact there's been nothing from Leonard Ellerbe, Floyd, or Showtime, you now realize Tank Davis pay-per-view tanked. The number I received is so bad, I'm holding off till I also have the streaming by number. Sounds like illegal hashtag Team Stream was in full force and effect. And let's be honest, folks, we've all been waiting to see how this pay-per-view performed because it had to compete with 2 other cards happening on 2 other platforms that same night.
You had a Matchroom card.
And you had a Top Rank card, neither of which came at an additional charge to the boxing fan, to the boxing community. Whereas in order to see Gervonta Davis versus Mario Barrios, you either had to buy it or you had to stream it.
Illegally stream it.
Steal it, which is becoming increasingly easy to do. Rick Glacier's not jumping the gun here, and neither will I. We don't know what the exact viewing figures are for this fight, but it's not encouraging that a full week later, we don't know what the number is. I mean, after the Spence versus Sean Porter fight, not but, 2-3 days later, you had Mike Coppinger already posting an initial set of viewing figures. Whereas here, we haven't heard anything all week, not even from Mike, who's on the ESPN side of things now.
You think that's why we ain't heard no numbers yet?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out. As Mike Coppinger has often been accused of being a little bit too partial, a little bit too biased to the people over there at the PBC, and now he's on the opposite side of the street. One is left to wonder if that hasn't costed him his patented sauces, as it were. Rick's waiting for the streaming figures to come in order to get the full view of just how good or just how bad this thing did. Because on one end, you have the conventional pay-per-view model, and on the other end, you have the digital streaming numbers, which are not the same thing. And in the absence of what are often referred to as Mike Coppinger's inflated set of numbers, in the absence of really any viewing figures being reported by any media outlet, this really is the first we've heard of just how good or just how bad Davis versus Mario Barrios did in the open market. It wouldn't surprise me at all to hear that the pay-per-view flopped, the pay-per-view tanked because it did have to compete with 2 other cards happening on 2 other platforms that same night, and those 2 cards, unlike this one, didn't come at an additional charge to the consumer. That in unison with rampant piracy in the sport of boxing in reference to pay-per-views, it's conceivable that people over there at the PBC and TMT, they took a hit. And in spite of all of Leonard Ellerbe's hyperbole about how big a star Gervonta Davis is...
Doesn't look like he's that big.
Oh, you might have packed the house. You might have sold some cheap seats down there in Atlanta, Georgia. But what about the pay-per-view buys? What about the viewing figures?
You know, because he doesn't fight on an app.
No way. He's too big a star for that. No. He's got to fight on pay-per-view. That's where he belongs. Where the consumer is little more than just a Google search away from a link that will allow them to view the fight free of charge. And all of that money, that's the money that Davis, TMT, and PBC are missing out on. The feeling is that if the people over there at the TMT had something to brag about, they'd be bragging about it the way they were after the Logan Paul versus Floyd Mayweather Jr. pay-per-view buys came in. You had something to brag about, you'd be bragging about it, but things have been eerily quiet all week, and that's not encouraging.
I don't know what the number is.
But a week later and no number? Well, that's not encouraging. Undisputed super lightweight champion Josh Taylor took to social media and said, "I'd just be sitting listening to scared little Leonard Ellerbe and Gervonta Davis talking shit like..."
What's being said isn't falling on deaf ears.
We can hear you. So does Josh. Leonard Ellerbe's reasons for not placing more emphasis on legacy fights like a Taylor versus Davis fight, it's just not convincing. You're trying to convince the world that Josh Taylor is so unknown in this country that it's not worth making a fight with him, and yet you were willing to make a fight with an even lesser known guy than Josh. Nobody knew who Mario Barrios was ahead of that fight. Who are you trying to kid?
No, I don't expect that Gervonta and Josh are ever going to fight.
As far as I'm concerned, those 2 guys are on 2 separate paths that won't cross.
So there's no sense in getting upset about it.
What people aren't upset about is how Leonard Ellerbe is foolish enough to think that he can pull the wool over their eyes. Talking about how there were only 1,000 people in attendance for Taylor versus Ramirez, when we all know the only reason there were only 1,000 people in attendance was due to the COVID-19 protocols. If not for that, believe you me, those UK fight fans...
They ain't shy about getting on a plane.
They weren't at full capacity. We all know that. So why is Leonard playing dumb?
Or is it that he thinks me and you are dumb?
Or is it that he is attempting to appeal to anyone that is dumb enough to believe that spiel? Anyone that is dumb enough to believe that line of horse shit?
I mean, that's gotta be it.
He is less concerned with Gervonta Davis's legacy as a boxer, how he'll be remembered, and he's more concerned with turning Gervonta Davis into some kind of crossover star, some kind of hybrid that appeals to some boxing fans.
A few.
And some...
The younger crowd.
The TikTokers, the youngsters, the kids who can't smoke a joint without pointing the camera in their face and telling all their friends about it.
That's who he really wants to appeal to.
Because that's where he thinks all the money is. And we'll find out how much money is or isn't there once we've got a real fix on what these viewing figures are. Better still, this is Leonard's school of thought as far as why he's guiding Gervonta Davis's career the way that he's guiding it, away from certain fights with certain fighters. When all the money in the sport of boxing is tacked on to those legacy fights, those big fights, those risky ones. Well, that's where most of the money is most of the time.
Think people want to get charged an arm and a leg for foregone conclusion fights?
Happy Meal titles against off-brand opponents. Somebody needs to tell Leonard that you don't sell the steak. You sell the sizzle. And that's the problem. There's no sizzle to these guys that Gervonta Davis has been fighting. He could very well be just as elite as his sycophants and acolytes think he is. But until he's involved in the kind of fights that put that on display...
We're only going to get so much attention.
We'll only get so far. Gervonta Davis has been on pay-per-view 2 times. He hasn't got my money yet. Don't know if he's gotten yours. And this is what he's up against. He's up against a real tough crowd that refuses to fork over their hard-earned cash, their hard-earned dollars, for his foregone conclusion fights and soft or semi-soft matchmaking in unison with pay-per-view piracy that the technology hasn't quite caught up to yet.
And it's not that you can't hit 1 million pay-per-view buys.
Floyd Mayweather Jr. just did with a YouTuber, but that's just it. You're not Floyd Mayweather Jr.
You ain't got it like that.